Hello. I don't know about most of you, but the one thing I have found most interesting in this course so far is that Gustav Holst, Ralph Vaughan Williams, and Percy Grainger did not invent the wind band. Now, to be fair, my professors in undergraduate school did mention groups that played transcriptions from opera overtures, but that was really about it. We did hear about wandering musicians in the Middle Ages. First, the multi-talented jongleurs. I found this description of what one did. I can play the lute, viol, pipe, bagpipe, panpipes, harp, fiddle, guitar, sapphoi, psaltery, organ, tabor, and the rote. I can also sing a song well and make tales to please young ladies, and can sing the gallant for them if necessary. I can throw knives into the air and catch them without cutting my fingers. I can jump rope most extraordinary and amusing. I can balance chairs and make tables dance. I can somersault and walk doing a handstand. Not an unimpressive list of skills. And then we would talk about troubadours and minstrels who sang of courtly love. But any talk about the development of waits or bands or whatever they may have been called seemed to have been left off the syllabus. In the history of the wind band, from about the 12th century in Europe, the first organized groups of players were to be those who performed civic functions for towns where they lived and they were funded from those town funds. They filled a variety of roles, as night watchmen on the lookout for the ever-present danger of fire to the mostly wooden towns, to the more human dangers of attacks from bands of rogues or armies from other places. Soon they were helping to keep track of time, much the way a church bell tower might remind people it was time to go to church, or by playing the obades before the coming dawn. By the 15th century, the waits and other civic bands had become ensembles of shawms and trombones and were even giving regular public concerts. Different countries in Europe had their own variations of these generalizations. In England, they were called waits. In Italy, they had the pifferi, a 3-member shawm band which played at the city hall, as well as a 6-member trumpet ensemble, and even an ensemble called trombadori. By the other 15th century, most of the Italian civic bands are called concerti, which would be the standard name until the classical period. In countries like the Netherlands, ensembles had such names as skalmeyers. In addition to their watch duty, the skalmeyers would play for the annual Ommegang, a parade that was part civic and part religious in nature. In German-speaking countries, they had the standpfeifers. About the same time that the civic band was playing for town folks, the courts also had musicians working for them. Whereas the outdoor nature of watchtower work made it necessary for those instruments to be loud, the court ensembles they were divided into loud and soft. The loud ensembles, labeled Haut, Stark, or Alta, would be almost pure wind instruments, mostly shawms and sackbuts. But they could also include trumpets, bagpipes, and percussion. The soft ensembles, bass, bajo, or still, would be made up of flutes or recorders, with lutes or lute-like instruments, and keyboard instruments. The picture of the tapestries that I found include combinations of the two, bagpipes with the flutes, a triangle and drum along with the bagpipes playing with the lute. The choice of which ensemble was to play depended on the place of the performance. Several rooms, smaller rooms, had the soft ensembles, and the larger rooms and outside events had the loud ensembles. But major changes were coming in the Renaissance as advances in woodworking were bringing about better instruments. The lathe made woodwinds with more artistic shapes possible, and advancements in boring made it possible to have more than one bore in a single piece of wood. This makes possible the great bass racket. With its combination of 9 bores, it could play lower than any other instrument of its time. Now, woodworkers were able to make familiar instruments, but in different sizes, as well as develop new ones. The instruments could be grouped into consorts or families, which would make the old idea of loud and soft ensembles obsolete. You can see the recorder family, a family of shawms, and a trio of crumhorns. Now, the ensembles could have a set of instruments from the same maker, helping with intonation. A new variety of instrument color could be achieved by alternating the consorts during a performance. By the middle of the 16th century, the idea of broken consorts, combining instruments of two families at the same time, began to be used to overcome inherent deficiencies in the consorts. For example, combining cornets and trombones would supply the lower parts missing from the cornets and the higher parts missing from the trombones. Also during the 16th century, the merchant class gained enough wealth that they wanted to also have private musicians play for them. But while this is happening, the towns still have their civic wind bands fulfilling many of the same roles as in the earlier Middle Ages. In London in 1500, the demand for wind music was so high that musicians were able to form an independent wind minstrel guild, whose main purpose was to keep paying jobs available only to London guild members. About this time, towns were starting to assess taxes specifically to maintain the civic wind bands and provide the town-owned instruments for musicians. The civic music of this time flourishes with wind music as well. Civic wind bands perform at churches as a part of their regular duties. That was common by 1550. There are references in the literature written by Anthony Barbe while he was chapel master at the Cathedral of Our Lady in Antwerp, as well as a volume of motets to be used by civic wind bands that was used in churches in Bruges, which was commissioned by Casson de Brouwer in 1484. But the most remembered wind music of this age was written by Giovanni Gabrieli, whose music is still transcribed today for brass ensembles to play. He was the first composer to write for more than 8 parts, the first to assign parts for specific instruments, and the first to treat the canzona as a polychoral composition. The first half of the Baroque era sees the wind band proceeding very much as it had by the end of the Renaissance. But by the middle of the Baroque, we began to see old Renaissance instruments retire and the modern oboes, bassoons, and flutes becoming part of the wind band. In France, Francois I had the main artistic wind band of his court called Joyeuse d'Instruments des Hautbois et Sac-Bout. It had a typical instrumentation of the broken consort of shawms and trombones. By as early as 1580, the time of Henry III, the new name of Le Grand Hautboy was being used, and by the time of Louis XIV, began using the modern oboe and changed the history of wind band in Europe. Le Grand Hautboy was then moved to Germany, along with French oboe players, where a new name, half French and half German, was born, the Hautboisten. There ended up being 2 versions of the Hautboisten, one for military use and one for court concerts, both using the same instrumentation. It is this court wind band that will eventually evolve into the harmonie musique. Le Grand Hautboy also brought with it the Overture de Camera and the French Overture. And by 1750, these became the Sinfonia, or Partita, and the Divertimento. It is the Hautboisten that serves as the bridge that connects Renaissance consorts to harmony music, providing an unbroken lineage of wind band music from the late Middle Ages to the present day. What we think of as a military band developed in Europe from Turkish influence. Battles with the Ottoman Empire brought Turkish culture close to the West, especially Vienna, which was on the border between East and West, and more than once there were Turkish armies at the gates of Vienna. The biggest influence musically seems to be from the percussion section, cymbals, called zil, and a primitive timpani called nakare, as well as a large bass drum. And there is also an instrument called the serevyen, which is called in English the Turkish crescent, or the jingling Johnny, I believe. During that time, European countries started having standing armies instead of hiring mercenaries, and armies could practice marching and introduce coordinated marching. The loudest Turkish style of band music made this more practical. During the 17th century, civic wind bands in most countries, Germany being the main exception, are in a state of decline. By the beginning of the 18th century, the London waits were the object of ridicule in the literature of the day. But while the civic bands may have been declined, many churches were still using wind bands to provide music for services. One reason given is that some felt the wind players were more in tune than their string-playing counterparts. As the Puritans were trying to strip the Anglican Church down to only a simple service with no ostentation, both bands and the organ seemed to be on the list of things to go. But during the time from around 1660 to 1860, some churches who had already banned the organ outright still used 6 or 7 person wind groups with the occasional cello to provide music. In Germany, the wind band tradition in churches stayed strong during this time. In the 17th century, Italian opera spreads over Europe. That, along with the arrival of a new string instrument, the violin, combined with financial trouble following civil unrest, caused many cities to reduce spending on traditional musical expenditures. This brings about the almost total disappearance of the civic wind band during the classical period. Along with the wind bands go the instrumental guilds. But while the town bands are going away, the new wind band, the harmony music mentioned above, is at the forefront of music by remaining a part of the court music scene. Again, it is mostly the German countries and countries under German influence that keep the wind band tradition alive during this time. Composers such as Haydn and Mozart are writing partitas and divertimenti, using the core of the wind section of the orchestra. While most music in the symphonic repertoire for winds is not very challenging, the music for harmony music shows that the wind players are up to the challenge. This is also the time when improvements in the horn brought them into harmony music. Haydn wrote for at least 8 divertimenti for pairs of horns, oboes, and bassoons. In France, under the leadership of André Jean-Joseph Lariche de la Poupinière, who formed his own orchestra, whose directors included Rameau, Stamitz, and Gossec. In this ensemble is the first documented use of both horns and clarinets in French orchestras, and that this is the combination that the French enthusiasm for wind ensembles with clarinets begins. The music of the French Revolution also had a major impact on the wind band world. The National Guard Band had at least 45 members, and this was at a time when most military bands numbered around 12. Also, the French fully accept the clarinet as the fundamental melodic vehicle, forcing the oboe to step down from its perch as the dominant voice. As we enter the 19th century, the military is glamorized as never before or since. Here you see an engraving of a band unit about to be overrun, but the bassoon player tries to intimidate the enemy soldier. The military bands of the 19th century can be broken into 3 periods. The beginning of the century through the Napoleonic Wars, the time when the harmony music style continues. The second phase, starting in about 1820, brings extraordinary developments in the construction of wind instruments, both improvements on old instruments and the creation of new, along with a growth in the size and instrumentation of military bands everywhere in Europe. Which leads to the third phase, the mid-century, the golden age of military bands. Based on scores from the time, a typical infantry band in 1830s Prussian military included valved instruments for the first time. Wilhelm Friedrich Wieprecht developed what he called an acoustical pyramid, the instruments of the ensembles being grouped into 3 registers. Piercing, notice the numbers of B-flat and A clarinets, the middle range and the low range. And just like our modern pyramid of sound, the low voices are the loudest, the middle voices the next, and the piercing instruments the softest. Wieprecht also devised instrumentations in 1860 for the cavalry, 21 total members, artillery, 39 members, the Jaeger, which I'm guessing is some kind of mountain group, and Jaeger actually means hunter, so I'm not sure, which has 21 members, and infantry, 47 members. In France during this time, about 1845, a commission is appointed to study the conditions of French military music. 2 men submit proposals for instrumentation. The number of musicians had been capped at 45. Michel Carafa and Adolphe Sax. The commission has the two conduct a field test. Carafa uses traditional instruments while Sax uses instruments of his own creation. But while Sax won the contest, his instruments were not immediately adopted. But as the wind band would evolve into the 20th century, the saxophones and one member of the sax horn family, the baritone, would become permanent members of the wind bands. The civic bands of this time in Germany were able to leave behind some of the obligations that were the foundations of the earlier civic bands and were able to focus on making music as art. In Vienna, they truly became entertainment, playing the famous waltzes and marches that are still identified with Vienna. And in England, there's the rise of the brass bands that become the center of civic pride, much like football clubs. Competitions like the one started in 1850s and 60s are still alive and well today. The thread that takes us from the Middle Ages, the watchtowers, that leads all the way up to the present time, because of things like the consorts in the Renaissance and the harmony music of the 17th century is what got us where we are today in terms of wind band music. There were many times where they could have turned the other way. Strings became a predominant force in the 1800s, so much so that when I was taking my undergraduate in the late 80s and early 90s, like I said before, there was not a whole lot of mention of wind band as a musical contributing force in the annals of music. Rout and Poliska just did not make that happen. But we are here today, and the band is going to be around for hopefully hundreds of more years, evolving with the times, but looking back to our past and hopefully doing a better job of remembering those who came before us. Thank you very much.